President Vladimir Zelensky said this week that Ukraine is now losing 60 to 100 soldiers every single day in combat. By way of comparison, just short of 50 American soldiers died every single day, on average, in 1968 during the Vietnam War. Again, in the war on terror in Afghanistan, only 2,500 American soldiers died over a 20-year period. That's about 125 soldiers every year. Clearly, the war in Ukraine is costing way more lives than Vietnam or even Afghanistan. General Viktor Muzhenko, the Ukrainian Armed Forces chief until 2019, he has warned that these losses could only worsen. This is one of the critical moments in the war, he says, but it's not the peak. This is the most significant conflict in Europe since World War II, and that explains why the losses are so great. In order to reduce these losses, Ukraine now needs powerful weapons that match or even surpass Russian weaponry. This would enable Ukraine to respond in kind. On Crux DeCode, why is there a go slow with the weapons that were promised to Ukraine, whether it's from the United States or from its European partners? And also, will the human cost of this war force both parties, that's Russia and Ukraine, to rethink? The Russian offensive in Ukraine is now primarily concentrated in the east, that's in Donbass, after the initial fighting failed to capture the capital, Kiev. Day by day, Russia is managing to make incremental gains, capturing one city after another. The Russian strategy is being billed as a medieval attrition approach, which basically means that until Ukraine gets the promised deliveries of American or British or other weapons, then these kinds of mass casualties are going to continue. That is particularly in the Donbass, in the eastern part of Ukraine. Now, this battlefield is so much more lethal than what we've seen over the last 20 years in Iraq, in Afghanistan, where we did not see the kind of numbers that we're seeing today in Ukraine. Like I said earlier, 20 years in Afghanistan, less than 3,000 American soldiers died. That figure has been surpassed many times over in this war in Ukraine. That level of attrition would also include leaders, sergeants, commanders, as well as generals. They are getting a lot of the brunt of these casualties because they are more exposed. They are constantly moving around. Ukraine had about 250,000 men and women in uniform before the war began. It was in the process of adding another 100,000. The government has not said how many Ukrainian soldiers have died in 100 days plus of war. No one quite knows the exact number of Ukrainian civilians too who've been killed or how many combatants have died on either side. The claims of casualties by government officials are all but impossible to verify independently. Western analysts estimate far higher Russian military casualties, by some estimates more than 25,000. But here's the grim tragedy. As these casualties mount, both Russia and Ukraine will also need replacements. That's the arithmetic of war. With a population of over 40 million people, Ukraine does have manpower, but for how long, no one quite knows. President Zelensky's admission of high casualties will only further galvanize the Ukrainian morale. Add to that an endless supply of Western weapons, which could help turn the tide. The more Ukrainians get to know about what is happening on the battlefront, the more they will want to continue to fight Russia. And this is also going to have an inverse effect on the number of foreign fighters who are willing to sign up for either side. Now again, the exact numbers of foreign fighters have been difficult to determine, but a recent report issued by the New York-based Counter-Extremism Project has come to this conclusion, and I quote, "Given the available information, it is reasonable to deduce that only a fraction of those who indicated an interest to travel to Ukraine after February 2022 actually did so," unquote. Their number ranges from merely a few hundred to a few thousand. This is dwarfed by the tens of thousands of Ukrainian volunteers who joined the units of the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Force, or the TDF. Researchers say the reason why so few foreign fighters ultimately took up arms are many, but one singular reason stands out. Unlike the other conflicts that drew large numbers of foreign fighters, whether it was Afghanistan in the 1980s, whether it was Syria in the 2000s, or the rise of the Islamic State, in the case of the Ukraine-Russia war, the government there in Ukraine took steps to organize as well as to vet these foreign recruits. There is also the acute lack of an ideological or religious element. The Ukrainian government runs a website outlining the 7-step process to join the country's international fighters. And while Ukraine says that as many as 20,000 people, including military veterans, have volunteered to fight, many never actually made the cut. In fact, the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, D.C. also told the Associated Press back in March that approximately 6,000 Americans had signed up. About half of them had been rejected even before the interview. Embassy officials also said that the 3,000 Americans who were actually allowed to go through the recruitment process, only about 100 or so had actually been accepted. Another reason why so few foreign fighters are now in Ukraine may come down to motivation. A major driver for foreign fighters in Afghanistan and also in Syria was ultimately religion and ideology. Whether to join the Afghan Mujahideen, to defeat the Soviet Union, or to fight and establish the Islamic State and its self-declared caliphate. Even an initial wave of about 17,000 foreign fighters who flocked to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine in 2019, before this current round began, they were driven largely by the ideology of white supremacism. The CEP researchers in fact found that many of those who volunteered to fight in the current war lacked that same type of ideological zeal. Russia, on the other hand, has not declared its casualties. In fact, Russia's last publicly released figures for its own dead was way back on the 25th of March. A general told state media that about 1,300 Russian soldiers had been killed. Ukraine and Western observers, in fact, say that real number is much higher. In fact, Zelensky said last week that more than 30,000 Russian servicemen had died, more than what the Soviet Union had lost in 10 years in Afghanistan. The British government last April had estimated the Russian losses at 15,000.